Coming to you live from the center of the universe in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. For those of you who may not have the privilege of ever having been here, it's about 60 miles west of Toronto, and it's home of Obama's favorite tech tool, the BlackBerry, was developed here. And let me just set the tone for our whole discussion around thriving in turbulent times with a story that goes back almost 20 years now to my earlier days with the Achieve Group and Zenger Miller, now all part of what's called Achieve Global. And back in the day, I remember being in a meeting with a group of colleagues and saying to my colleagues, well, once we get through this crazy period and things settle down again, and then I stopped and it kind of hit me, and I said to my colleagues, you know, I think I've been saying that an awful lot lately. And we kind of nodded and agreed that maybe what we need to get our head around is that this crazy period is life, is normal, that we need to figure out there's no getting past, well, once I get this project done or get that restructuring in place or get the new position filled and things will settle down. Well, of course, do they ever settle down? No. About that time or a little bit after that, I came across a comment from one of my favorite authors and researchers and writers, Warren Bennis. I've been a long-time follower of his work, and he said some very nice things about one of my more recent books, The Leader's Digest. So clearly the man's brilliant. I'm quoting him even more now. But here's what he said going back, again, 18, 20 years ago, that we're living in a period of volatility, complexity, ambiguity, and tumultuousness. And then he quotes one senior executive as saying, if you're not confused, you don't know what's going on. Well, if I could see raised hands, I would ask, how many of you know what's going on? I think a few of us could say, I think we know what's going on. Gene Kerr, American playwright, once said, even years before this, if you can keep your head when everybody else around you is losing theirs, it's just possible you haven't grasped the situation. It's always one of the possibilities. Well, let's get deeper into where this material is coming from and where we're heading over our next hour together. The material has evolved over a number of years of work with all sorts of groups and organizations and workshops, and is drawing primarily from my most recent book, Growing at the Speed of Change. It is my 7th book, and okay, I do confess I am a serial writer. But I know this group, I've recognized a number of people that are in this group, and I know that you're a pretty well-read group. A number of you have actually read some of my earlier books. And so I will touch on some themes. If you're familiar with my earlier work, you'll certainly see some themes coming together. So using the growing theme, we actually had the working title of this book was Thriving in Turbulent Times, the title of this webcast. And we decided then, as we were finalizing the book, to stay with the growing theme. So the two books, Growing the Distance and Growing at the Speed of Change, are really, well, this is really a sequel. They're really very well matched together. And it's the only two of my 7 books that are focused more broadly on personal growth and on personal development. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover here briefly. We're going to build a little more on our overall theme of thriving in turbulent times. We're going to talk more about perceptions and reality. I had a lot of fun with this section, and there's a lot of interesting work going on in this whole area of consciousness, reality, perceptions. We'll just skim the surface of it briefly and use it as a stepping stone to get into the main point of this work. Some of you who are familiar with some of my earlier work know that I used to talk about navigator, survivor, or victim. I'm now talking about lead, follow, or wallow as basically being the 3 choices that we have whenever we're faced with any sort of setbacks or challenges. We'll then talk about what are some of the ways that we may not even recognize at times we're slipping down into the swamp, starting to do a little bit of wallowing, and maybe using a few of the popular excuses for avoiding personal change. I'll take a look at a few of the more popular ones, in that section. Then an overall theme of everybody must lead. Leadership is an action, not a position. This has been a theme throughout most of my work over the last 30 years in this field, and it's certainly a core theme of this work and of this book. and we will get deeper into that theme. That'll take us into talking about 9 steps to personal leadership. Now, these aren't sequential steps, but they're what I see as the 9 key elements that keep coming up when you look at more modern research. You look back through more the timeless principles of leading ourselves and others. These steps seem to constantly come up. I'll give a broad overview of those, and we'll finish up. I know many of you here on this call are concerned about how do you develop leadership across the organization. You're not here just for your own personal development, but what are ways that you can use some of these approaches more broadly across the organization? So we'll touch on some of that. I hope we'll have a little bit of fun as we go along. I hope you find that some wit happens as we move along here, and we'll try to minimize those dad jokes, which is a bit of a bone of contention around our family. So let's jump into then the first topic area, which is this whole theme of thriving in turbulent times. And it really starts, I think, with this basic realization and this basic sense that there's no getting through this crazy period, that constant change and unexpected shifts happen all the time, that certainly is life. Change itself isn't really news. That theme's been around for a long time. But the pace with which change is happening is news. The speed with which it's happening, especially in these last few years, certainly lots of evidence that change is speeding up. In fact, many times as I'm working in organizations, I hear staff, frontline kinds of people, supervisors, sometimes being just absolutely convinced that their managers have some sort of master plan or are trying to control the pace of change in some way, and that they just aren't letting them in on it. And that sort of conspiracy thinking, in my mind, is kind of similar to thinking, well, aliens live among us, or the U.S. government caused 9/11. There's lots of these kinds of conspiracies that just don't prove to be true, because change has been with us for a long time. Let's look at get some long-term perspective on this. This comment about life being a series of natural, spontaneous changes, we shouldn't resist them, we should let reality be reality. Well, that goes back quite a few years. That goes back to the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. Or here's a comment that sounds pretty contemporary. All the social change, the upheavals, differences between groups, society, lust for wealth, envy, distrust of neighbors, overseas wars, taxation issues, questioning authority, turmoil is worldwide. Oh, yeah, that could describe a lot of what's happening right now. Well, that was actually describing 1780 by a historian. So this is designed to give us a bit of perspective and to say, well, change is life. And so the next question starts to become, well, how do we predict this stuff? How do we prepare for some of these changes? And I had lots of fun. I've done this in a couple of books, but certainly in this one, of really looking at this whole area of predictions. It's a huge business, multi-billion-dollar industry, trying to predict the future and trends and social trends and forecasting and so on. And a number of major studies have been done on it and basically have said the only predictions that we can accurately rely on are 2-day weather forecasts. That's it. Most other predictions are no better than flipping a coin, or in some cases, the experts are even worse than the wisdom of crowds. So I predict more unpredictability. I predict, in other words, more life. Life is constant change. So how do we deal with that? How do we prepare for it? Well, my theme, my feeling is it's through growing. Whether those unexpected changes are deadly threats or whether they're really great opportunities for us depend almost entirely on how we respond, because there really is no getting through this crazy period to some mythical place of predictable stability. It's just not going to happen. Or maybe we could paraphrase Bob Dylan here and say, how do we deal with change? Well, the answer, my friend, is growing in the wind. The answer is growing in the wind. I know you don't want me to sing that one. So let's go on and take a look then at how we react or respond to change or problems or issues in our lives. And I think back a number of years ago, I ran into an associate, an acquaintance I hadn't seen for a few years, and when I ran into him, kind of remembered why I hadn't seen him for a few years. And I said, "Hey, Phil, how's it going?" He said, "Same crap, different day." And then he proudly piled it up for me to wallow in with him. Well, how do you argue with that? Because if we are wearing our crap glasses, it's everywhere. And the crap really becomes our life. And life really is an optical illusion. We're learning more and more about that, the weird, quirky world of quantum mechanics and physics and the deeper discussions. Some of them have been going back thousands of years now around reality and what exactly is reality. So we have to be careful about the glasses we put on, frameworks that we use. We have to be careful that we're not wearing our crap glasses because it really can ruin our eyesight and our insight. Peter Jensen, a sports psychologist and friend of mine, lives in Toronto. He has a wonderful phrase for this. He calls it optical rectimitis. It's just a crappy outlook on life. Well, we actually took this word crap, C-R-A-P, and made a little acronym out of it, which is can't readily absorb positivity. There's the real crap. There's the real problem. So, of course, in life is not fair. Whatever hits the fan won't be evenly distributed in life. There's lots of injustice and just plain unfairness that takes place. But our choice is whether to stand in it or not. And that choice has a lot to do with how we frame situations. Here's an optical illusion. You've probably seen others like this one. Pretty simple, straightforward one. We have two dots here. They're exactly the same size, yet our eyes play tricks with us. They look like they're different sizes. Why is that? Well, it's because of how they're framed. The perspective is changed by how it's surrounded. So the problem, the issue, the change is influenced by the glasses or the frames that are being used. Here's another interesting optical illusion. This one actually came out of Popular Science Monthly back in 1899, so 110 years ago. And what do you see here? Well, if you look slightly to the left, you can see a duck and its bill and the eye looking to the left. If you look slightly to the right, you can see a rabbit's mouth at the very extreme right and an eye looking to the right and its ears behind its head. Now, of course, here's the trick question. Which one is reality? Which one is real? Well, certainly they're both real. In case you need to have another look at that slide, it is on page 47. I know some of you already have Growing at the Speed of Change. You might want to come back and look at that again if you didn't see both those creatures in there. So the big issue becomes, what's our home on the range of reality? What's the reality that we're creating for ourselves? Is it at the end of pessimism, or is it at the end of optimism? Because when depending which end we're at, of course, depends on which glasses that we put on. So if we're pessimistic, we're going to come back and talk more about this theme of fear and courage. It's the energy levels that we generate or that we tune into that very much creates our reality. It's our sense of hopelessness or hopefulness. Martin Seligman, one of the University of Pennsylvania leaders in this whole field of cognitive psychology, and which is a lot of what this is really encompassing, did his master's thesis on learned helplessness or the loss of hope. Or are we looking at why things can't be done, what's impossible, or are we exploring what some of the possibilities are? Because the more on the optimistic side of the spectrum we are, the broader is our focus on those possibilities. Are we seeing the worst in people or looking for the best in people? Those of you familiar with the old McGregor theory X, theory Y. Theory X is looking for the worst, expecting the worst, seeing the worst, and saying, see, told you, I knew that's the way people were like, or looking for the best and turning around and having that same sense of, well, there we are. That's what I expected. It's like the little girl that was out riding in the car with her mother one day, and she said to her, Mommy, where are all the stupid jerks and idiots today? And her mother said, well, they only come out when your father's driving. So what is it that we're looking for? Because that determines, there's been research done now on the nature of luck, and we can see patterns, similar patterns there. Are we focusing again on the problems or the impossibilities or the solutions? And to no great surprise, there's been a lot of research, actually hundreds of books have been written in the last 8 years on the issue of happiness. And pessimists are certainly a lot less happy than optimists. Now, they would sit there and say, well, they're living in the land of delusion. They're not living in the real world. Well, they're having more fun living in their real world, in their reality. So the choice then, it all really boils down to, and as we get to the heart of the matter here, the choice really is about whether we're going to lead, whether we're going to follow, or whether we're going to wallow. Those are the daily, I would even argue maybe hourly or minute by minute kinds of choices we have every time we're faced with a new or different kind of situation, or even as we choose thoughts to put in our head. So we can start here by looking at the center of this, kind of middle of the whole piece, and we can look at the area of following. So when we're following, we're looking to others for a bit of direction. We're waiting to see just how this might unfold, what might happen here. If we're a little more on the positive side and looking upward, we tend to see possibilities, but we may be skeptical. And that could be a good thing too. A little healthy skepticism could be exactly what's needed. If we're on the downside, looking down, on the more negative side, we're feeling more and more helpless, more and more cynical, more, oh, here we go again, more of this kind of crap. Every time I turn around, I got to deal with more of this, or forget about it. There's no point. Why even bother? And we can end up like poor old General Sedgwick, who's a casualty of the U.S. Civil War. He's buried at Arlington Cemetery. And these were his last words. They couldn't hit an elephant from this distance. And that truly was the end of General Sedgwick. Look it up on Wikipedia someday. It's an interesting little story that I keep being fascinated by when we just get too sure of ourselves. So as we now turn that range of reality scale on end, and so off to the left we see the scale where at the top end of the scale, in the plus 100 setting, would be the extreme of optimism. At the other end of the scale, in the negative 100, would be the extreme of pessimism. So as we explore these two areas, we can say, well, as we walk up the stairs, the leadership stairs, and up the reality scale, we're living in leadership territory. Everything up on this part of the scale is where leaders tend to live. As we go down, and so the kinds of thinking with leaders is things like, well, how can we capitalize? How can we deal with this situation? The old lemons and lemonade kind of thinking. Whereas down below, as we get down in the scale, I drew this little diagram to show that as we start to slip down the slippery slope, it just drops off into the depths of wallowing. And down here, there are lots of conspiracies. I just know they're up till 2 o'clock last night trying to make our lives miserable. They're just out to get us. They're trying to do us in. So there's lots of wallowing, and I really enjoy that whole term of wallowing. And part of the reason, by the way, that I've shifted this language to leading, following, wallowing is to say that these are states. These are temporary states. They can be changeable states. But when we're wallowing, it's interesting to look at some of the definitions. So here we are in the swamp, wallowing, and Wiktionary came across this definition, which I thought was perfect to describe what happens when we're sliding down into the swamp. So this definition says that wallow means we're rolling about, as in mire, tumbling all around, floundering as a swine wallows in mire. And then I love this next little line, this example. With Smithers out of the picture, I was free to wallow in my own crapulence. Well, that's putting on those glasses again, deciding what it is we're going to do. And so the definition continues to talk about being unclean, defiling, filth, or gross vice. And some of this gets pretty extreme, but it is what wallowing is all about. And if I was going to throw in a dad joke, I'd say it's a bitter swill to wallow. But I've promised many of my audiences I won't throw in too many dad jokes. So one of the things that happens as we get down into the swamp is we end up in a very dangerous place of Pity City. Maybe you know some people who spend a lot of time in Pity City. It can be a therapeutic place to visit once in a while. I was working with one group a while ago. It's actually a workshop in Calgary, and one of the people in the group said, my husband is the mayor of Pity City. He not only lives there, he's running the place. So it's a dangerous spot to be. And it's one of the popular vehicles for getting there is the good old bitter bus. I'll bet you know a few people that ride the bitter bus into work every day, ride the bitter bus to family events, ride the bitter bus just all around life, and are, of course, trying to get other people on the bitter bus. Misery does love company, and maybe you even know a few bus drivers who are driving that bitter bus down Helpless Highway, past Whining Way, Pessimism Place, Dead End Drive. And what are some of the signs that we're clearly going through Frown Town on our way into Pity City? Well, there's no hope. There's no way. We tried that once. They'll never go for it. Forget about it. That'll never work. You can't trust those kind of people anyway. It's just a dead end. We may as well give up. Clear signs that we are wallowing and down in Pity City. And maybe a few dad jokes snuck in there as well. So as we take a look at where are we spending a lot of our time? Are we leading? Are we following? Or are we wallowing? Sometimes it takes a bit of awareness and stepping back and maybe even a bit of a catastrophe to get us to rethink and refocus. Daniel Boone, the great woodsman, frontiersman, once said that he was never lost, but he was bewildered once for 3 days. So sometimes we may not be totally lost, but it's easy to get off track. It's easy to get a little bit bewildered. Now, of course, being a real he-man, he probably didn't ask for directions either. That wouldn't have helped things much. So all of this could be summarized in an old adage you may have seen before. This one's been around for a few years, that it is our attitude or the framework or the cognitive frameworks that we use more than our aptitude or our IQ that determines our altitude. And there's a whole bunch of research now in the field of emotional intelligence that is very much proving this to be the case, that it is our EQ, our emotional intelligence, much more than our IQ or intellect that makes a huge difference in our happiness, success, effectiveness. So what are some of the wallow words? Well, I had some fun in this section identifying what were some of the common ones that I've heard over the years or that seem to come out. As we look at the swamp here and we look at the alligators in the swamp, Carl Sandburg, a historian, said that there's an eagle in me wants to soar and a hippo in me wants to wallow in the mud. So when we get down there wallowing in the mud, what are some of the popular excuses and slippery excuses that can pull us into this deadly swamp and maybe having us flirting a bit with disaster like that bird sitting on top of the alligator? So there's a list that I came up with. Today we won't be going through all of these. I'm going to highlight a couple that seem to be the most popular. And as you look at this list, and I know a number of you are on this call. We actually had almost 900 people registered for this call this morning. So I know a number of you are on here with groups and teams and with others. So you may want to, after the call is over, spend a bit of time looking at this. And I'm going to look at the 9 steps in a few minutes as well and identifying which ones really apply. One of the more popular ones, and I guess this proves that the list is not in any order of priority, the last one here, number 10, we don't communicate. That's a very popular one, and we constantly hear issues around we don't have enough communication around here, and of course that has many elements to it. But one of the elements for our discussion today is that it often shows that we can really get caught up in wallow hollow, that we can sit back and basically say, well, they never tell me anything. They're not giving me the information. My boss doesn't keep me informed, or they don't let us know what's going on, and we're the last to know around here what's happening. Well, that's typical wallowing behavior. Leading behavior is to basically say, well, I'm going to go find out. I'm going to go get the information that I need. I'm going to go make it happen, or take the initiative and make that communication. Another popular one these days, number 3, I'm overloaded and overwhelmed. Lots of people feeling that way, and again, it can come from a variety of places. one of the places that it comes from is when individuals or groups allow others to should on them. You should always be available. You should answer every email. You should have your door open all the time. You should be on 24/7. And we allow others to basically take control of our time and our agenda. And if we don't take control of it ourselves, we're going to end up having somebody else controlling our time and our agenda. And what we can also fall into the trap of, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on, is in today's world of multitasking, we can fall into the trap of attention deficit trait, ADT, a new term that's coming up that's similar to ADD, which is attention deficit disorder, but unlike ADD, which is a disorder and often is a inherited thing, ADT is learned. It's a learned trait. And there are many now who's studying these sorts of things, who believe that we're in the midst of an epidemic in the Western world and that we've got close to a crisis with our attention spans, with overstimulation, with really learning how to keep things in the right balance. And one example of that, I think, that particularly applies to teams and organizations, and those of you here today as a team, may want to spend some time looking at, do we spend enough time on our stop doing lists? We keep adding to our start doing. We keep adding to all the projects and all the things that we want to accomplish. But what do we take off? What do we stop doing in order to do that? How do we prune? How do we bring in more discipline? Well, we move on. Another popular one, I don't have the authority. Or, of course, any of these we can put, we don't have the authority. Whole teams and groups often fall into any of these as well. So this is where we can whine and freeze ourselves, paralyze ourselves, underselling ourselves, because one of the most common ways that we undermine our ability to influence or take away our own power is by thinking we don't have any, or by confusing persuasion and position power. Strong leaders tend to use a lot more effective persuasion power. And even though they may be in positions of influence, oftentimes they're not, they're using and relying upon the power of persuasion. So don't undermine and undersell just how much authority or ability to persuade you might have. Then we go to another popular one. Number 4, another one we're going to come back to. The old moose on the table. Similar to elephant in the room. Moose do love living in swampy areas, by the way, but they're more northern creatures. They wouldn't want to go into this swamp with the alligators. But the metaphor is basically, here we are in a meeting or a team, a group, and we're sitting around a meeting room, and there are some issues, there are some problems, there are things that we're not addressing, and they're just like a moose on the table. We're pretending they're not there. We're hoping they'll go away. We're passing things around their legs. It's eating off of one end of the table, this moose. It's dropping moose pies off of the other end of the table. And nobody is saying, whoa, time out here. Let's get rid of this stupid moose. And because we don't get rid of the moose, it starts having babies. And then more moose start to show up. And the problem just keeps getting worse. This is a common issue. We're going to come back to it later on. There is actually a Moose Tracks quiz on our website and in the book, the same quiz, that allows you to do a little bit of a test and take a look at just how big of a moose infestation you might have. Our last one we'll look at here on the list, is in rounding out kind of the most popular ones of this top 10, is I'm too busy to learn, or I'm too busy to be more effective. I'm too busy to learn how to get better. And yet, of course, the sad thing is that I've got lots of time to make up for the fact that I didn't do it right the first time. I don't have time to train and develop maybe other people. I don't have time to get to the root cause of a problem or an issue. Therefore, the problem continues and gets worse. And as it gets worse, it gives me even less time to get to the root cause, which means it's getting even worse, but it's giving me even less time, and the vicious circle continues. Strong leaders find ways to break that circle and begin to turn that around to the virtuous circle by investing the time. So as you look at this list, I invite you to think, what might your own top 3 be, your personal ones that are tempting to really undermine yourself, or to basically use as an excuse perhaps for not growing and developing further. And then as a team, if you replaced we with I in most of those statements, what might you, and it might even be an interesting exercise for you to do as a team, is everybody individually choose your top three and then compare and see how are we as a team potentially sliding down into the swamp of wallowing. So that takes us into our next area, which is the whole notion of everyone being a leader and the need to build shared leadership across the organization. Now, I came across this article that I'm about to quote you here this summer. The book was already finished, so it really was kind of reaffirming and reinforcing as I came across this, but it very much sets the tone for this whole discussion about everybody needs to be a leader. So this is taken from a special issue of Harvard Business Review, July-August issue this year, and it was called Managing in the New World. And here's some of what the researchers and authors have found, that it's their sense once the economy returns, we're not likely to go back to the way things were before. That's, of course, how change happens throughout history and throughout the world. We move to something new. So what do they see is needed to continue moving to something new and to deal with this new world that we're in now? Well, faster adaptation. We've got to learn how to move more quickly. We've got to get more people involved. We've got to develop the next set of practices, obsolete ourselves. Peter Drucker said that for years, that we need to obsolete our products, our services, even as they're at the height of their success. We need to then help people to embrace this notion of continuous change, constant change, thriving on that change. But it's a balance, because we can't make it so chaotic that everyone wants to just completely bail out, but to recognize that we need to build our organizations to change. Jim Collins wrote the famous book, Built to Last. Another group of professors actually wrote a book linking into that one that was called Built to Change, and looked at those good to great kinds of companies and found that one of their big things about them was that they were able to do what you're seeing here, to faster adaptation, embrace disequilibrium, and generate leadership across all levels of the organization, building leadership everywhere throughout the organization, and making it much more of a shared kind of effort. So that is a core theme here, and that is one of the focal points of this work. And it has been, as I said, for years, this has been a phrase that I've used, that leadership is action, not a position. And it certainly was what was behind pulling this book together, trying to pull together an edutaining, easy to read, browsers kind of now digest, using the magazine style format that my previous books, Leaders Digest and Growing the Distance, used. And it's also why we put together pricing that allows for substantial discounts to be able to bring this work more broadly across the organization. So looking then at what are the steps to personal leadership, building it across the organization or doing it on our own, what are the key steps? Well, I've identified what I see as 9. They aren't sequential. They could be happening in parallel. They could be all different sort of stages, but there seem to be 9 principles or 9 core ideas, a number of which are closely related together. So I'm actually going to be clustering some of these as we go through them. There's not enough time here today to go through this in any great depth. I actually pulled together in this section, in these 9 areas, hundreds of tips and techniques and best practices, all aimed at climbing the steps, the leadership stairs, to move higher up on the leadership range of reality. So let's take a look at how these themes are pulled together. This, by the way, is the actional part of the inspirational, which is in the book subtitle. So there's 3 here that are very closely linked together. These first 3 steps, as I said, these aren't really sequential, but these steps I tend to see as being somewhat foundational or somewhat closer to what's needed at the beginning. And it's really linking back all three of these steps about the imagery or the visualization that we might use, about our focus on strengths and values, about how we use our affirmations and our attitude of gratitude. Those really link back directly to our range of reality. Because what those three steps are describing is what strong leadership is all about. Strong leaders make people hopeful. Strong leaders build confidence. Strong leaders reinforce the positive. And so we're seeing a wave of new approaches and research and work these days, things like appreciative inquiry, positive psychology, a brand new field that's opening up, strength-based coaching or leadership. There's a whole wave of this coming along now because there's so much evidence to show that this is the beginning point of building a highly effective team, culture, or certainly for our own effectiveness and our own success. And it is really how we hypnotize ourselves to a large extent, just whether we're using images and visualizations of what we want and drawing that towards us, or whether we're using positive values and strengths and affirmations. In lots of ways, this is very much like a magnet, that we create powerful magnetic fields that attract the events, the people, the circumstances towards us, which then causes maybe someone who's looking on to say, wow, you were really lucky. Wow, that was lucky. Well, Richard Wiseman in the UK has done a huge amount of work on luck and has found that there are recurring patterns of people that just seem to have a lot of the lucky breaks. This has also been called the law of attraction. Now, that's been popularized more recently, but that actually goes back to over 100 years ago. A guy by the name of Thomas Troward actually first developed this concept of the law of attraction, that we tend to draw towards us those things, those people, those circumstances, events that we see for ourselves. So let's move along and look at a couple of other steps. Steps 4 and 5 are very closely related, which is looking at how we use our time and the whole issue of balance, to what extent we're living our lives effectively and slowing down and getting things into the right balance. 4 and 5 is really about balance. And I want to come at this in a couple of ways. One is to say that one of the things that I see a lot are managers, supervisors, caregivers, parents, people on front lines providing service levels who give so much to everyone else that they're often not strengthening themselves enough. I think of the analogy when I'm flying in airplanes, which I do a lot. Fortunately, in all my years of flying, I've never seen the oxygen masks come down. Hopefully, I never will. But parents who are traveling with young children are always reminded, if the mask comes down, put the mask on yourself first and then take care of your child. Now, that has to be emphasized over and over and over again because our tendency is to give to our child first, put the mask on them first. But of course, the great danger is we could end up passing out, and then we're both in danger. So taking care of ourselves first, that's a lot of what 4 and 5 is about. But then we get deeper into this and we start to look at how are we managing our time? Because if we're not managing our time effectively, someone else will. And one of the key elements of managing our time is this idea of multitasking. There's a very high cost that comes with multitasking. In today's society, we tend to value and even admire people who are great multitaskers. Well, here's some of the price that we pay. It causes a lot more stress, and I speak at conferences on workplace health and organizational health. And certainly, multitasking is one of the great causes of stress. And one study actually showed that multitasking makes us stupid, that we lose IQ points when we're, for example, if we have the email notifier coming on, dinging us every time or popping up or vibrating on our BlackBerry or whatever it is every time a new email comes in, and then we're like Pavlov's dog, we just can't resist, got to go see what that email is all about, and we end up making ourselves stupider. Marijuana smoking, by the way, only causes a 4-point drop in IQ. You have to miss a whole night's sleep in order to get the 10-point drop that's caused by the technology here. So I don't know about you, but I can't afford a 10-point drop in IQ. So I shut all that stuff off. Well, then we look collectively at our teams and our organizations and ourselves, and we look at how much time is being sucked up today by email, the email beast or the email vampire. One study here shows that 40% of most workers, I think this is primarily professional white-collar workers, spend their workday on email, and about a third of that they consider wasted, which this study calculates in the U.S. economy is a huge cost in productivity and profits. So are we allowing ourselves to get sucked in? Have we developed ground rules and protocols for the way we use email? And many teams need to do that today. And many teams also need to, back to the notion of pruning and stop doing lists and discipline, is succumbing to the tyranny of the urgent. Here's a quote from a focus group we did with one group a couple of years ago where they're having all kinds of problems with urgencies and priorities, and they were just in quite a schmozzle. And so one of the people here said, well, we have lots of lists, projects, priorities. We're constantly making these lists. We're setting these action plans, but we seldom really see anything through before some new urgent priority comes at us. And we seem to operate by random brain impulse. I love that phrase. Seem to be lots of that going on. And then he went on to say we're like nervous water bugs with ADD that frantically flit from one thing to another. Actually, I would amend that to say it was ADT, attention deficit trait, that this team has clearly taught itself, and unfortunately is a very common problem. Well, let's continue on with three more steps here that are closely related. And this is the broad overview. I think of today's session a bit like a city tour. We're giving you a bus tour around the city, and Heather and I love to travel, and we love to take the tour first of all, get highlights of the city, and then decide where to go back to. Well, this is certainly a perfect example that there's lots more depth here you may want to get back to. So the theme underlying steps 6, 7, 8 certainly starts with the theme of courage. Aristotle actually believed that courage was the foundation of all human virtues, that courage was what makes the others possible. So as we come back to our diagram and we look at being above on the positive side, up the leadership stairs, or sliding down into the swamp, or we look at our range of reality, courage is at the top, fear is at the bottom. And so when we're operating as leaders, we're doing the things we really don't want to do. We're doing the things we're really afraid to do. I've even heard some people define success as it's doing those things that other people won't do. That often makes people successful. When we're sliding down into the swamp, we're in the grips of fear, which is Roosevelt so famously talked about in the midst of the Depression back in the 30s, that's the very thing we need to fear most, is that fear grips us. It's like one of those alligators just grabbing hold of us and pulling us down under to drown us. And that there's a big danger there if we abandon faith and sneer at hope, which of course is what people who are in the swamp tend to do. They look at someone up on the leadership stairs and say, get real. You're not living in the real world. That's not reality. So it takes some courage to face and deal with the moose on the table, to deal with the issues that everyone's tending to stay away from. We call these courageous conversations. And sometimes when we're facing the bull, just like Pete Leonard, this is the character out of one of my books, Moose on the Table. He's a fictional character. It's my only work of fiction. And as he starts to face the bull, he begins to see that, and he looks in the mirror, that he's really looking at the bull. That in many ways, he's creating a lot of these issues and problems for himself, especially by avoiding them. And so that's a key theme that is used throughout this book, but a theme that's kind of underlying that isn't quite as explicit, but I'm going to throw out here on the table very explicitly, is most teams need a put up or shut up rule, or I've known some teams that actually have a no scab picking rule, which might gross, I know we have healthcare people on this call, might gross you out especially, but it's the idea that if there's an issue we can't do anything about, let's not keep picking at it. But if it is something we can do something about, let's do it. Let's get to work on it. Let's not avoid it. Let's not brush it under the table. Let's not pretend that it isn't there. Let's go and make it happen. And so that might mean that we need to have a better job of understanding what issues we control within our team, or I control for myself, what issues I can influence, and what issues we have no control over whatsoever. So this may be where upward leadership, for example, comes into play. So I need to, perhaps there's a tendency to kind of sit back and say, oh, well, that's the boss or that's senior management, there's nothing we can do, and to give up control, to undermine ourselves. Well, think about that. Take a look at that. There are many, many examples of people who were able to influence their boss, influence up through the organization, and help to bring about change. So can we increase our influence? Can we build the skills of influence more effectively? They really are skills, and they can be developed. Do we want to develop them? Do we have the courage to develop them? Or as I look at this slide, I think particularly of the wisdom of the serenity prayer. Help me to accept with serenity the things that can't be changed. Well, there are lots of things in life. As the poet Longfellow said, the best thing to do when it's raining is let it rain. So there's times when we just have to accept what it is. Maybe even some of those moose we have to domesticate, make them into pets, and just have them hang around the office. Not much we can do to change them. But then to have the courage to change the things which could be or should be changed. Now that's certainly the things we can directly control, which first and foremost is our own attitude and perception and focus, and it's around what we could do to increase our influence. And then, of course, the last part of the Serenity Prayer talks about the wisdom to know the difference, and that is some of the challenge and the difficulty. Well, lastly, our last step is the overall theme of this work and of growing the distance, the theme of changing and continually growing with change and dealing with change by growing. And it's expressed here that change will happen, and change does happen, and either we're going to change and be proactive and be out in front of it, or we're going to eventually be changed. So if the rate of external change exceeds our rate of internal change or growth, we're eventually going to be changed. There really is no neutral ground. There is no kind of sitting by and letting things go. So this whole section of Grow For It is really about how we develop our emotional intelligence, for example, how we develop our skills, how we develop our leadership. There was a point at which there was a lot of debate. Are leaders born or made? That debate's pretty much done now. The debate also tended to be around emotional intelligence for a few years. Are we born with the emotional intelligence levels we have, or can we develop them? Both of those debates have now very conclusively shown that we make ourselves, we make our emotional intelligence, we make our leadership. It may not be easy to do, we may need a lot of help to do it, we may need feedback and other mechanisms to spur us on to doing it or provide direction in doing it, but we can make our skills, make our leadership. Well, as we start to wrap things up here, our last section is looking at leadership strategies, particularly for those of you who are concerned with how do we move forward and how do we develop people throughout our organization. So ways that this book and the thinking that was behind the book, this is to give you kind of behind the scenes feeling and look at, excuse me, the thinking and ways that we can deal with this. Sorry about that. So the accelerating pace of constant change. Well, we've talked about this in various ways. Almost every organization today has unpredictability with markets, economies. There's constant restructuring. There's changes in the organization. These are very common themes. And the acceleration of these themes, as I said at the outset, change itself isn't news. The pace with which it's happening is really the news. And the pulsing that's really going on right now around change is a big part of that news. So how do we deal with it? Well, again, it's the notion of constant growth and helping people grow and develop. So all of you who are in positions or roles, whether you're either supporting, such as learning and development kinds of positions, or you're leading teams, you've got people in your groups, your organizations, what can you do? Well, clearly finding ways to increase leadership all through the organization and really bring alive this notion that leadership is an action, not a position. Leadership is what we do more so than who we are. There are people in positions of appointed positions of leadership who aren't really leaders at all. They're managers, they're bureaucrats, they're technicians, they may even be supervisors, but they aren't necessarily leaders. And then, of course, there are those who are not in formal leadership roles who exert a strong amount of leadership and a strong amount of influence. So we need to share and build leadership all across the organization. We need to help people recognize things like the bitter bus and pity city and sliding into the swamp, and just start bringing in more of that perspective and bringing in more of that awareness that we have these sorts of choices. We can lead, we can follow, we can wallow when dealing with change. So we need to help strengthen buy-in, and a big part of that is explaining why, helping to understand why. Now, again, someone who's wallowing will say, well, nobody tells me why. I don't know why. I think this is stupid. Why the heck we're doing all these changes? Of course, someone who's leading will go find out, go get the information they need, and then bring that perhaps back to their team or back to their organization to at least understand why is this happening. I may not agree with it, but I at least need to understand it. So we need to adapt language, approaches. It might be no scab picking rules, or one group had a thing where you had to raise your hand and say permission to visit Pity City, and someone else might say, okay, we've got 10 minutes, or let's have a pity party right now. And as they use that language and use those approaches, it helps to build awareness around the choices that we have as we're dealing with these changes. And of course, many organizations these days, I'm going to bet many of the people listening here, you have a set of values of some sort that maybe underpin culture. The trick and the challenge in many organizations is either one of two things. Either there's too many values, it's a long laundry list, we're going to be everything to everybody, throw in motherhood, kitchen sink, apple pie, we believe in everything. I think any more than 5 values is not core values, and really in many ways is no values. And then the second part of this is the values often have a very high snicker factor, that people are not really connecting with or really believing this stuff because they're not seeing it reinforced and used on a day-to-day basis. So we've got to find ways to keep and revitalize and bring those values alive. Or if they're not organizational values, then it may just be our team values and guidelines. We need to, of course, continue learning and development programs. They don't always have to be formalized ones. It may be as simple as let's spend time within our team stepping back periodically and asking what should we keep doing, stop doing, start doing? Or what is it that's working or not working? Let's every once in a while do a strengths and gaps assessment and identify what strengths we can then leverage and build off further and what gaps we need to develop or we need to close. So especially for people who don't read this kind of material or aren't getting deep into leadership training and development, you need to find other ways, and that's part of what I've tried to do here as well with this book, is make a multi-layered kind of approach that allow people to be drawn in and start to get deeper and deeper into this thinking and using humor and having a bit of fun with it, but getting us into what are very serious issues for dealing with change. What are some examples and ways that approaches like this have been leveraged? This slide draws off of a number of experiences that I've had over the years with various groups and organizations using my materials or other materials. This isn't all just about my own materials, but ways of bringing these kinds of approaches and some of this kind of thinking into the organization. The language, having fun with the language, talking about the bitter bus, pity city, moose on the table, crap glasses, scab picking. This can all be kind of humorous ways. You know, in some groups where someone would say, whoop, I think I hear the bitter bus pulling up outside. Oh, it looks like you're off to Pity City. That can be some fun ways, but can really help remind people that we have these kinds of choices. Of course, books can be distributed to staff or personal group. I've been involved in this one a couple of times. It's been fascinating to be see in organizations book clubs where groups of keen learners get together and share experiences, perspectives. Sometimes different groups will present different chapters, let's say, out of a book and so forth. And so as well, using these sorts of materials or books like this and many others are sometimes sent out before team planning sessions, retreats, used to help frame what's going on, or used as part of ongoing development, more formalized kinds of workshops and self-study programs. There's a self-study guide that goes with the Growing the Distance material, which is linked to all of this. You could use it as part of announcing changes or a change management initiative. Often IT is where a lot of that comes from. Could be a foundation for project or improvement teams. Again, this language, the reminders to each other, all of this can very much help with the success of those sorts of efforts. And it's part of setting ground rules or even having teams or at meetings set those kinds of ground rules. So those are some of the ways, and I'm sure if this were a true discussion, that we'd have lots of other ideas and ways that some of you have brought this sort of thinking, these sort of approaches, this kind of material into the organization. So we're now approaching the end of our hour together, and I hope that this webcast was worth far more than you paid for it, and that maybe you saw some spots on the city tour that perhaps you want to revisit and go back and get deeper into. And you may be wondering, well, at this stage, well, how do I get further into this material, use this material, some of the frameworks, the ideas that I've presented? Well, there's a couple of options. The Clemmer Group is in the business of doing this kind of work, so you can certainly on our website see a wide variety of keynote presentations, workshops, and retreats that we provide, and we're always happy to talk with you further about how something might be put together for your needs, because almost everything that we do is very customized. The other thing, for all of you who've hung in here till the end, I hope that this will be a little payoff for you. If you don't already have, or even if you do have a copy of Growing at the Speed of Change and want to play Secret Santa or give the gift of growth, positive growth in the new year, here's an offer that we're extending for you. We actually ended this offer. Well, originally we started in September. It went till the end of October. We extended it one more month in November, and then it's now off of our website, except for those of you who are in on the secret here of the secret address, which is jimclemmer.com/241 will get you in to take advantage of that special pricing, and which is essentially you have to buy 200 books or more to get 50% off in our regular pricing. This allows you to get anything less than that at a 50% discount. And if you are shopping already on online retailers or just feel like it's even more convenient, they've got all your information, you just want to order from you're an existing customer of the retailer, you can go to just about any online retailer and the book is available there. So I see we have about 2 minutes left, and I always find that it's better to end a little bit early rather than a little bit late. I hope that you've taken away lots of ideas here today. I hope that you have in fact been inspired to action, or inspiraction, a term that we made up. And I really appreciate you joining us today, and keep growing.